The first time I saw the property, I fell in love. 10 acres of rolling grassland in western Montana, backed by the gentle rise of pine-covered foothills that eventually gave way to the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. It was everything I'd dreamed of during my 20 years cooped up in a Chicago high-rise, managing other people's money while barely having time to enjoy my own. "This is it," I told my wife, Elaine, as we stood on what would become our front porch, watching the golden afternoon light paint the landscape. "This is where we build our forever home." The property was part of a new development called Bridger Ridge Estates. The developer had parceled off what was once a sprawling cattle ranch into 20 ranchettes, each with at least 5 acres. It was the perfect compromise, enough land to feel like we were living the Montana dream without the responsibility of managing hundreds of acres. The sales agent, a slick fellow named Garrett, had assured us that the HOA was hands-off and just there to maintain property values. The annual fees were reasonable, just $750, and would cover maintenance of the community roads and the shared bridle paths that wound through the development. "Most folks out here just want to be left alone," Garrett had said with a wink. "The HOA makes sure nobody's putting up pink flamingos or turning their front yard into a junkyard, but otherwise, they stay out of your business." That was 3 years ago. Our custom timber frame home was finally complete, and we've been living on the property full-time for just over 6 months when I first met Vivian Hargrove. I was mending a section of fence along our western property line when a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up on the dirt road. A woman in her early 60s emerged, dressed in pressed khakis and a blue button-down that looked like it had just come from the dry cleaner. Her salt and pepper hair was styled in a severe bob, and she wore the kind of pearl necklace that suggested old money. "Mr. Lind," she called out, picking her way carefully across the field in what were clearly not ranch-appropriate shoes. "I'm Vivian Hargrove, president of the Bridger Ridge HOA board. Do you have a moment?" I set down my post-hole digger and pulled off my work gloves to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, her smile practiced but not reaching her eyes. "Call me Jack," I said. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Hargrove?" "It's about these fence posts," she said, gesturing to my work in progress. "I'm afraid they're not in compliance with the HOA guidelines." I blinked at her, confused. "These are just standard T-posts. Most of the properties here use them." "Yes, but Section 7, Paragraph B of our covenants, clearly states that all perimeter fencing must be either split-rail cedar or black aluminum estate fencing. These metal posts with wire simply won't do." She handed me a printed violation notice. "You have 30 days to bring the fence into compliance, or the association will levy a fine of $100 per day." I stared at the paper, then back at her. "Mrs. Hargrove, I've got nearly 2 miles of perimeter fencing. The kind of fencing you're talking about would cost tens of thousands of dollars. The guidelines were clearly stated in the paperwork you signed when you purchased the property," she said, her tone suggesting I was being deliberately obtuse. "Everyone else has managed to comply." That wasn't true. I'd seen plenty of properties with similar fencing to what I was installing. But before I could point this out, Vivian checked her watch. "I've got another matter to attend to. I suggest you review the guidelines carefully. The board takes these violations very seriously." With that, she turned and picked her way back to her vehicle. As I watched her drive away, I noticed a man watching from the adjacent property. He raised his hand in a half wave, then walked over to the property line. "I see you've met the Dragon Lady," he said with a wry smile. "Welcome to Bridger Ridge, where your dream home comes with a side of nightmare HOA." His name was Frank Delaney, a retired high school principal who'd moved out here with his wife 3 years earlier. Over beers on my porch that evening, he filled me in on what I'd really gotten myself into. "Vivian moved here from Connecticut about 5 years ago," Frank explained. "Got herself elected to the board within 6 months, and she's been president for the last 3 years. She runs this place like her personal fiefdom." But the sales agent said the HOA was hands-off. I protested. Frank laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Yeah, Garrett's good at his job. What he didn't tell you is that the developer still controls 3 seats on the 7-member board, and they vote however Vivian tells them to." She's tight with the developer. Rumor is they're distant cousins or something. I thought about the notice crumpled in my pocket. So what do I do about this fence situation? Frank sighed. Honestly, you either comply or you fight. And fighting the dragon lady isn't for the faint of heart. As the sun set over the bitterroots, casting long shadows across what I had thought would be my piece of paradise, I had no idea that this fence dispute was just the opening salvo in what would become a years-long war. The fence violation notice was just the beginning. 2 weeks after my encounter with Vivian, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This time, they were objecting to the small tractor shed I'd built near the eastern edge of our property. All outbuildings must receive prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee, the letter stated. Furthermore, the metal roofing material is not on the approved list of materials. I called the number listed on the letterhead and reached Vivian's second-in-command, a retired banker named Howard Spaulding. Mr. Spaulding, this is Jack Lynn from Lot 17. I'm calling about this notice regarding my tractor shed. Ah, yes, Mr. Lind. The shed will need to come down. I'm afraid. Come down. It's just a simple shelter for my tractor and tools. Nevertheless, it wasn't approved, and the metal roof reflects sunlight in a way that's disturbing to your neighbors. I bit back my first response. Which neighbors? My nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and the shed isn't even visible from their property. That's not relevant, Mr. Lind. The covenants are clear. I took a deep breath. Look, I understand the need for some standards, but this seems excessive. Can I submit the plans retroactively? There was a pause. You can submit them, but I should warn you that metal roofing materials have been consistently rejected by the committee. You'd need to replace it with cedar shakes or architectural shingles. The shed had cost me $3,000 to build. Re-roofing it with cedar shakes would add at least another $2,000, and there was still the issue of the fence to deal with. I'd like to attend the next board meeting, I said. That would be next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the community center, Howard replied. But I should warn you, the board rarely overturns Architectural Review Committee decisions. I spent the next few days reviewing the HOA documents, all 57 pages of them. The covenants were indeed detailed and restrictive, but they were also vague in places, leaving plenty of room for interpretation that seemed to consistently favor Vivian's aesthetic preferences. When Tuesday came, I arrived at the community center 10 minutes early. About 20 homeowners were already there, scattered around a large conference room. Vivian sat at the head of a long table, flanked by Howard and a younger woman I didn't recognize. 4 other board members filled out the table. The meeting began with standard formalities, minutes from the previous meeting, a treasurer's report, committee updates. Finally, they reached the open forum portion. Mr. Lind, I believe you wanted to address the board. Vivian's tone suggested she was granting me a great favor. I stood and faced the group. Thank you. I recently received violation notices regarding my perimeter fencing and a tractor shed on my property. While I understand the desire to maintain certain standards, I believe these particular requirements are unnecessarily burdensome. I went on to explain the cost implications and pointed out that several other properties had similar fencing to what I'd installed. Those properties are in the process of being brought into compliance. Vivian cut in. Just because others are violating the covenants doesn't mean you can. With all due respect, Mrs. Hargrove, I've reviewed the covenants carefully. Section 7 refers to visible perimeter fencing. My western boundary isn't visible from any community road or neighboring residence due to the natural topography and tree line. A slight murmur went through the room. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Mr. Lind, I don't think you understand how this works. The Architectural Review Committee and the board determine how the covenants are interpreted. If you don't like it, you're free to sell your property and move elsewhere. The bluntness of her statement hung in the air. A few homeowners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older gentleman in the back spoke up. I think Jack makes a fair point about the visibility issue. Maybe we could consider a variance for portions of fencing that aren't visible from community areas. Vivian's gaze could have frozen hell. Thank you for your input, Mr. Carruthers. However, allowing exceptions creates a slippery slope. Next thing you know, Everyone will claim their violations aren't visible from somewhere. But that's what variances are for, I persisted. To acknowledge that one-size-fits-all rules sometimes need reasonable exceptions. The board has already ruled on this matter, Howard interjected. Unless you're prepared to submit a formal variance request, along with the $500 processing fee, there's nothing more to discuss. $500 just to ask for permission to keep my existing fence. It was extortion, plain and simple. As the meeting moved on to other business, Frank caught my eye from across the room and gave me a sympathetic nod. After the meeting, he introduced me to a few other homeowners who had run afoul of Vivian's reign, the Carrutherses, who'd been fined for leaving their garbage cans out 12 hours after collection, the Mendozas, who'd been cited for the natural meadow they'd cultivated instead of a traditional lawn, and the Johnsons, whose application to install solar panels had been rejected 3 times for aesthetic concerns. "She's getting worse," Barbara Carruthers whispered. "When we first moved here 5 years ago, the HOA was reasonable. Then Vivian arrived, and it's been downhill ever since. Why doesn't someone challenge her for the board presidency?" I asked. The group exchanged glances. "People have tried," Frank said, "but the developer still controls 3 seats, and Vivian has Howard and Diane Collins in her pocket. That's 5 out of 7 votes right there. Plus, she's not above playing dirty," Barbara added. "The last person who ran against her suddenly found himself being fined for every little thing. Eventually, he gave up and moved. As I drove home that night, my headlights cutting through the darkness of the rural Montana night, I couldn't help but feel I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't the peaceful country life I'd envisioned. It was suburban tyranny disguised as rustic living." Elaine was waiting up when I got home. "How bad was it?" she asked. "Worse than I expected. The Dragon Lady lives up to her reputation." "So what do we do? Pay for the fancy fence and re-roof the shed?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It would cost us over $20,000 to comply with everything. And I get the feeling this is just the beginning. Once they know you'll roll over, they never stop." "Could we fight it legally?" "Maybe. But Frank says the last couple who tried that ended up spending more on legal fees than the compliance would have cost, and they still lost." Elaine was quiet for a moment. "You know, when we bought this place, you promised me peace and quiet, not a war with the neighbors." "I know. I'm sorry." I pulled her into my arms. "I'll figure something out." But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't see a way forward that didn't involve either capitulating to Vivian's unreasonable demands or engaging in a costly, stressful battle. Neither option seemed like the Montana dream we'd signed up for. Little did I know, Vivian was just getting started. The following week, I received not 1 but 3 new violation notices. The first cited excessive outdoor lighting from the motion sensor security lights I'd installed around the house and barn. The second claimed my split-rail fence along the driveway was the wrong height, -44 inches instead of the mandated 48. The third, and most ridiculous, objected to the color of my barn door, which was apparently rustic red, when the approved color was barn red. I couldn't even tell the difference when I compared the color swatches. "This is harassment," Elaine fumed, slapping the notices down on the kitchen counter. Plain and simple. She was right. It was clear Vivian was sending a message after my challenge at the board meeting. I called Frank to vent. "Yeah, she's notorious for this," he confirmed. "They call it the Vivian Special. When someone crosses her, suddenly their property has violations no one noticed before. There has to be something we can do," I said. "Well, there might be one thing," Frank said hesitantly. "The annual HOA election is coming up in 2 months. 2 board seats are opening. One of the developer's appointees is stepping down, and Howard's term is up. You think we could actually win seats on the board?" "It's a long shot," Frank admitted. "The developer will replace their person with another puppet. But Howard could be vulnerable. He's been Vivian's henchman for years, and a lot of homeowners are tired of it. If we could get someone to run against him." "Someone like me?" I asked. "You'd be perfect. New blood, successful career background, and you've already shown you're not afraid to stand up to Vivian." I thought about it. Even if I won, I'd still be one vote against Vivian's controlling bloc, but it would be a start. I'll do it, I decided, but we'll need to build a coalition. Over the next few weeks, Frank and I quietly reached out to other homeowners who had grievances with the HOA leadership. We met in small groups, careful not to attract attention. The Carrutherses hosted a barbecue. The Mendozas organized a trail ride. Each gathering was a chance to gauge support and develop strategy. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA intensified. I received a certified letter informing me that fines for my ongoing violations now totaled $3,200 and would continue to accrue at $200 per day. A lien would be placed on my property if the amount wasn't paid within 30 days. I consulted a lawyer who reviewed the situation and gave me sobering advice. The HOA does have the legal authority to levy these fines and place liens, she explained. However, some of these interpretations of the covenants seem excessively strict. We could challenge them, but litigation would be costly and time-consuming. What about the election? Could they legally prevent me from running for the board? No, they can't stop you from running if you're a member in good standing. But, she hesitated, but what? They might claim your unpaid fines make you ineligible. I'd recommend paying under protest to preserve your candidacy. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I wrote the check, attaching a letter stating that I was paying under protest and reserved the right to challenge the validity of the fines. The next day, I officially submitted my candidacy for the board position. Within hours, Vivian herself was at my door. "Mr. Lind," she said coolly, "I understand you've submitted your name for Howard's board seat." "That's right," I replied, matching her tone. "I believe the board would benefit from some fresh perspectives." "Fresh perspectives?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "You've been here less than a year. You barely understand how things work in a community like this." "Maybe that's exactly what's needed." Her smile disappeared. "Let me be clear, Mr. Lind. Running for the board is a mistake. Even if by some miracle you were elected, you'd be one vote against 6. You'd accomplish nothing except making enemies of people who could make your life very difficult." The threat was unmistakable. "Is that why you're here, Mrs. Hargrove? To threaten me? I'm here to offer friendly advice. Drop your candidacy, bring your property into compliance, and we can all move forward amicably. Continue down this path and, well," she shrugged, "Montana winters can be very isolating when you don't have the support of your neighbors." After she left, I called Frank and relayed the conversation. "She's worried," he said, sounding encouraged. "She wouldn't have come herself if she wasn't." The next day, I discovered why. Frank had been busy rallying support and had secured commitments from nearly 20 homeowners who promised to vote for me. In an association with only 42 properties, that was significant. But Vivian wasn't giving up without a fight. A week later, every homeowner received a glossy mailer praising Howard's service and subtly implying that I was a troublemaker who would destroy property values with my urban ideas. How my desire for reasonable fence requirements constituted urban ideas was never explained. Then came the community email claiming I was under investigation for operating an unauthorized business from my property. A complete fabrication based on the fact that I occasionally took Zoom calls from my home office. The campaign turned ugly fast. Anonymous notes appeared in mailboxes warning that I planned to turn the community into a tourist trap by advocating for short-term rentals. I didn't, and that I wanted to eliminate all architectural controls. I simply wanted them applied reasonably. But the worst blow came when someone reported me to the county for an allegedly illegal barn construction. County inspectors showed up unannounced, combing through my property and ultimately finding nothing wrong, but not before the rumor mill had churned out stories about my illegal construction. Through it all, my supporters stood firm. In fact, the dirty tactics backfired, turning more homeowners against Vivian's regime. Even some who had previously stayed out of HOA politics were disturbed by the viciousness of the campaign. 3 days before the election, Frank called me with disturbing news. "Jack, someone broke into the community center last night." "What? Was anything taken?" "Just one thing, the locked box with the absentee ballots." My heart sank. We had been encouraging supporters to vote absentee if they couldn't make it to the meeting. Those ballots represented at least a dozen votes in my favor. They're saying it was probably just kids, Frank continued, but the timing is awfully convenient, don't you think? The night of the election arrived. The community center was packed, with nearly every homeowner in attendance. A stark contrast to the typical board meeting attended by just a handful of concerned residents. Vivian called the meeting to order, her composure intact but her eyes betraying her tension. Before we proceed to the election, I'd like to address the unfortunate incident regarding the absentee ballots, she began. Due to the theft, we'll only be counting in-person votes tonight. A chorus of protests erupted. That's not fair to people who can't be here. The bylaws require absentee ballots to be available. Vivian banged her gavel. The bylaws also give the board discretion in exceptional circumstances. We've made our decision. I stood up. Mrs. Hargrove, at least a dozen homeowners cast absentee ballots. Disenfranchising them isn't just unfair. It's potentially illegal. Her eyes narrowed. Are you accusing the board of illegality, Mr. Lind? I'm saying that every member has the right to vote. If you proceed with this election without accommodating those who voted absentee, you're inviting a legal challenge to the results. The room fell silent. Vivian conferred quietly with Howard and the association's attorney, who had mysteriously appeared for this particular meeting. Finally, she turned back to the assembly. The election will be postponed for 2 weeks to allow for new absentee ballots to be submitted. It was a small victory, but an important one. As the meeting broke up, several homeowners came up to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Barbara Carruthers hugged me. You stood up to her, she said, her eyes gleaming. No one does that. But my satisfaction was short-lived. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. A surveyor's stake driven into my front pasture, about 50 feet from my property line with the community road. Attached to it was a notice from the HOA, Notice of Easement Enforcement. This stake marks the boundary of the HOA's 50-foot easement along all community roads. All structures, landscaping, and non-compliant fencing within this easement must be removed within 7 days. The stake was positioned directly through the middle of Elaine's prized rose garden and perilously close to our front porch. I checked our property documents. There was indeed a utility and road maintenance easement, but it had never been enforced before. On other properties, people had landscaping, mailboxes, even decorative entrance gates within this supposed easement. When I called Frank, he was equally shocked. They've never enforced that easement in the 5 years I've been here. This is a new low, even for Vivian. That afternoon, similar stakes appeared on 6 other properties, all belonging to my known supporters. The message couldn't have been clearer. Support Jack Lind, and you'll pay the price. But Vivian had miscalculated. Far from intimidating my supporters, the blatant retaliation galvanized them. And it brought new allies to our cause, homeowners who had previously tried to stay neutral, but now couldn't ignore the HOA's abuses of power. As Election Day approached again, the battle lines were clearly drawn. On one side stood Vivian and her loyalists, desperately clinging to control. On the other stood a growing coalition of homeowners who had simply had enough. What none of us realized was that the true breaking point was yet to come. The postponed election was only days away when I received an urgent call from Elaine while I was in town picking up supplies. "Jack, you need to get home right now," she said, her voice tight with anger. "The HOA has contractors on our property, and they're tearing down the fence." I nearly dropped the phone. "What? They can't do that." "Well, they are. They've got some paperwork they claim gives them the right." I tried to stop them, but they threatened to call the sheriff if I interfered. I threw my purchases into the truck and sped home, gravel spitting from my tires as I tore down the country roads. When I pulled up to our property, the scene made my blood boil. A crew of 4 men was systematically removing my wire fencing, piling the T-posts and wire in the back of a flabbed truck. Vivian's silver Mercedes was parked nearby, and she stood supervising the operation with an expression of smug satisfaction. I slammed my truck door and stormed over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Vivian turned, completely unfazed. "Enforcing the covenants, Mr. Lind." Section 12.4 gives the HOA the right to remedy violations after proper notice. You've had over 3 months of notices. You can't just come onto my property and destroy my fence. She held up a document. This work order, signed by the full board, says otherwise. You might want to read your covenants more carefully. I snatched the paper from her hand. It was indeed a work order, authorizing the removal of non-compliant fencing, with the costs to be charged back to me. According to their estimate, I'd be billed over $5,000 for the privilege of having my own fence torn down. This is trespassing, I growled, pulling out my phone. I'm calling the sheriff. Feel free, Vivian replied coolly. I've already spoken with Sheriff Daniels about this enforcement action. He's aware that we're operating within our legal rights. Of course she had. In a small community like ours, Vivian had undoubtedly cultivated relationships with local officials. I turned to the workers. Stop what you're doing right now. You're on private property without the owner's permission. The crew looked uncertainly between me and Vivian. The foreman, a weathered man in his 50s, shrugged apologetically. Sorry, sir. We've got a contract and permits. If there's an issue, you'll need to take it up with the HOA. The reality of my powerlessness in that moment hit me like a physical blow. These men were just doing their job. The real enemy was standing a few feet away, watching with barely concealed triumph as my property was violated. I turned back to Vivian. This isn't over. Oh, I think it is, she replied. The election is a formality at this point. The developer has confirmed their new appointee will be aligned with the current board's vision. Even if you win Howard's seat, which you want, you'll be a lone voice howling in the wilderness. She leaned closer, dropping her voice. Face it, Mr. Lind, you're not cut out for life here. The sooner you accept that and sell, the better for everyone. As she walked back to her Mercedes, I stood rooted to the spot, watching strangers dismantle the fence I'd worked weekends to install. Elaine came to my side, slipping her hand into mine. What are we going to do? She asked quietly. I had no answer. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt utterly defeated. We were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and apparently without legal recourse. The HOA's power seemed absolute and unchecked. That night, we held a crisis meeting at our house. Frank, the Carrutherses, the Mendozas, and half a dozen other supporters gathered in our living room while I recounted the day's events. They're not just coming after me anymore. I concluded, this is a message to all of you. Step out of line, and they'll find a way to make you pay. So we just give up? Barbara asked, her voice thick with emotion. Let them run roughshod over all of us. I don't see what choice we have. I admit it. The lawyer says challenging them would cost a fortune, with no guarantee of success. Even if I win the board seat, I'll be outvoted on every issue. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The fight seemed to have gone out of everyone. Then Phil Mendoza, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. What if we could change the game entirely? All eyes turned to him. What do you mean? I asked. Phil was a retired civil engineer who'd moved to Montana after 30 years working for the state of California. He was methodical and precise, not the type to suggest wild schemes. I've been studying the plat maps and the original development plans, he said, and I noticed something interesting. He unfolded a large map on my coffee table. It showed the Bridger Ridge development and surrounding lands. Our development road connects to the county highway here, he said, pointing. But the right-of-way runs through a 40-acre parcel that isn't part of the HOA. So what? Someone asked. So who owns that 40 acres? Phil asked, looking straight at me. I stared at the map. The parcel in question was just beyond my western boundary. Undeveloped land that I'd assumed was still part of the old ranch or perhaps owned by the developer. I don't know, I admitted. Why does it matter? Phil's eyes gleamed. Because whoever owns that land controls access to over half the properties in Bridger Ridge, including Vivian's. The development road isn't a county road. It's a private road with an easement through that 40 acres. The implication slowly dawned on me. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you find out who owns that land, Phil said quietly. And if it's for sale. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. I'll call my realtor first thing in the morning. The next day brought stunning news. The 40-acre parcel was indeed for sale. The owner was the elderly widow of the rancher who'd sold the original land for the development. She'd held onto this piece because it contained a natural spring, but now, at 87, she was looking to simplify her affairs. My realtor arranged a meeting with her that same afternoon. Mrs. Campbell was a straight-talking Montana native who didn't mince words. That piece has been on the market for 2 years, she told me as we sat at her kitchen table. The developer offered me half what it's worth, thinking I'd take it because it's landlocked on 3 sides. Landlocked except for the road running through it, I noted. A shrewd smile crossed her weathered face. You noticed that, did you? That's why I never sold it to him. That road was my husband's idea. Let the developer pay for building it through our property with just an easement, not a transfer of ownership. So the easement agreements, they're with you personally? With my trust, she confirmed. And I've never signed anything expanding those easements or transferring them to any HOA. My mind was racing. Mrs. Campbell, I'd like to make you an offer on the property. 2 days later, I was the proud owner of 40 acres of Montana wilderness, strategically positioned between the county highway and Bridger Ridge estates. The price had been steep, nearly all of our liquid savings, but worth every penny for what it represented: leverage. I didn't make my purchase public immediately. Instead, I waited for the HOA election, which proceeded as scheduled that weekend. Despite Vivian's machinations, her candidate couldn't overcome the groundswell of opposition we built. When the votes were counted, I had won Howard's seat by a margin of 3 votes. Vivian's face was a mask of cold fury as she grudgingly welcomed me to the board. I trust you'll approach your duties with the seriousness they deserve, she said stiffly. Oh, I intend to, I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. In fact, I have some ideas I'd like to discuss at our next executive session. Little did she know that by then, the next phase of my plan would already be in motion. The 40 acres wasn't just a strategic purchase, it was the foundation of a counterattack that would shake Bridger Ridge Estates to its core. The HOA had put up a fence on my ranch. Now I owned the land that controlled their access, and I was about to return the favor with interest. The morning after the election, I called a meeting of my core supporters at Phil Mendoza's house. Frank, the Carrutherses, and a few others gathered around Phil's dining room table as I revealed my purchase of the 40-acre parcel. Holy hell, Frank whispered when I finished explaining. You actually did it. The question now, I said, is how we use this leverage most effectively. Phil spread out the survey maps he'd obtained from the county records office. The easement is clearly defined, 30 feet wide, following the existing road. It grants access for residential ingress and egress to the properties in the development. What about utilities? Barbara asked. Separate easements, Phil confirmed. Power, water, and telecom have their own agreements with Mrs. Campbell, now with Jack. So technically, Frank said slowly, you control who uses that road. Not exactly, I cautioned. The existing easement grants access to all current homeowners. I can't legally prevent them from using the road to reach their properties. But you could regulate how the easement is used, Phil suggested. A slow smile spread across my face. Now you're thinking like Vivian. My first board meeting as a member was scheduled for the following Tuesday. For 5 days, I kept quiet about my land purchase, focusing instead on reviewing HOA documents and financial records that had previously been difficult to access. What I found was illuminating. The HOA had over $380,000 in its reserve fund, far more than necessary for a small community with limited common areas. More troubling were numerous payments to HES Consulting, a company I discovered was owned by Howard's brother-in-law. They'd been paid over $42,000 in the past year for vaguely described landscape management services. I also found evidence that the architectural review process wasn't being applied consistently. Certain homeowners, primarily Vivian's allies, had received rapid approvals for projects similar to ones rejected for other residents. Armed with this information, I arrived at the board meeting ready for battle. After the usual formalities, Vivian turned to the agenda item regarding my property. As you know, we've begun remediation of the non-compliant fencing on Lot 17, she said smoothly. The initial removal phase has been completed at a cost of $5,347, which will be assessed to Mr. Lynn's account. I waited for her to finish before speaking. Before we continue, I'd like to address a few financial irregularities I've discovered in the association's records. Vivian's eyebrows rose. Financial irregularities? Our books are impeccable, Mr. Lind. Then perhaps you can explain why we've paid ACS Consulting over $42,000 for landscape services when our common areas consist of less than 2 acres of land. I slid copies of the invoices across the table, particularly since HCS Consulting appears to be owned by Howard's brother-in-law. A ripple of murmurs went through the attendees. Howard's face flushed red. That's a baseless accusation, he spluttered. Is it? I have the corporate registration documents right here. I distributed another set of papers. This appears to be a clear conflict of interest that was never disclosed to the membership. Vivian rapped her gavel. This is not the appropriate forum for wild accusations, Mr. Lind. If you have concerns, they should be submitted in writing to the board for proper investigation. I'm a board member now, I reminded her, and as a fiduciary of this association, I have not just the right, but the obligation to raise these concerns. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. We'll form a committee to review your allegations. Now, returning to the matter of your property. I'm not finished, I interrupted. I'd also like to discuss the inconsistent application of architectural standards. I held up side-by-side photos showing identical gazebos, one approved for Vivian's Alley, one rejected for the Mendozas. It seems some homeowners are more equal than others in Bridger Ridge. The meeting descended into chaos as supporters from both sides began shouting. Vivian banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. When the room finally quieted, her voice was ice cold. Mr. Lind clearly came prepared to disrupt this meeting rather than contribute constructively. I'm tabling all further business until next month, when cooler heads may prevail. As the meeting broke up, Frank gave me a thumbs up from across the room. Phase 1, exposing the corruption, had begun, but it was only a minor skirmish compared to what came next. The following morning, I filed the deed for my new property with the county clerk. By afternoon, word had spread throughout Bridger Ridge. When Vivian called demanding to know what I was up to, I politely suggested she direct any questions to my attorney. 3 days later, residents of Bridger Ridge arrived home to find a notice rolled up and secured to their front doors with rubber bands. It was from me, dear neighbors. It began. As you may have heard, I recently purchased the 40-acre parcel adjacent to our community through which our access road runs. I want to assure you that regular residential access will continue uninterrupted. However, I am conducting a review of the easement agreements to ensure they are being properly honored. During this review period, please note that any commercial or construction vehicles requiring access to Bridger Ridge must obtain a permit from the landowner, me. Permit applications can be submitted through my attorney. The phone calls started within minutes. Vivian, predictably, was first. This is outrageous, she seethed. You cannot restrict access to a private community road. I'm not restricting access, I replied calmly. I'm simply ensuring that commercial traffic across my land complies with the terms of the existing easement, which specifies residential ingress and egress only. The HOA has contractors scheduled to begin road maintenance next week. They're welcome to apply for a permit. The fee is only $500, the same amount you charge for variance requests. Coincidentally, there was a long silence before she spoke again. This is war, Lind. No, Vivian, I replied evenly. This is consequences. My next move was more direct. The weekend after filing my deed, I hired a local contractor, not one of the HOA's usual cronies, to install a cattle guard and gate at the point where the development road crossed onto my property from the county highway. The gate remained open, but its message was clear. This was a controlled access point now. Next to the gate, I erected a large sign, private road, easement access only. All commercial vehicles must display permit. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Vivian's allies were furious, claiming I was holding the community hostage, but many others, especially those who had suffered under Vivian's regime, quietly expressed their support. "You got her running scared," Frank told me after Vivian called an emergency board meeting that I pointedly did not attend. "She's talking about legal action, but her attorney apparently told her it's not a slam dunk case." "What about the other homeowners?" I asked. "I don't want them to feel I'm punishing everyone. Most people understand what you're doing," he assured me. "The ones who've been on the receiving end of Vivian's tactics are actually enjoying seeing her get a taste of her own medicine." The emergency board meeting yielded nothing but bluster. Vivian's motion to allocate $50,000 for legal action against me failed when 2 other board members abstained, worried about the uncertain outcome and the potential cost. Meanwhile, I became very selective about which commercial vehicles received permits to cross my land. The HOA's favored fencing contractor? Denied. The landscaper owned by Howard's brother-in-law? Denied. But the local handyman who had been blackballed by the HOA for speaking against Vivian at a previous meeting? Approved, no fee required. Construction on Vivian's elaborate pool house addition ground to a halt when her contractors couldn't get their trucks through. The HOA's planned replacement of perfectly functional street signs with more aesthetically appropriate versions, at a cost of $22,000, was indefinitely postponed. But my most strategic move came when I discovered that the developer was planning to begin construction on the final phase of Bridger Ridge, 6 new luxury homes on the eastern edge of the community. Heavy equipment would need to cross my land daily for months. I denied their permit application without explanation. 2 days later, I received a call from someone I'd never spoken with before, Cameron Wallace, the developer himself. "Mr. Lind," he began without preamble, "I understand we have a situation that needs resolving." "Mr. Wallace," I replied, "I've been hoping to speak with you. Your construction permit application was denied, but I'd be happy to reconsider it under certain conditions." "I'm listening." "I'd like to meet in person, with our respective attorneys present." There was a pause. "That can be arranged." The meeting was set for the following Monday at my attorney's office in Missoula. Cameron Wallace turned out to be younger than I expected, mid-40s, with the tanned, outdoorsy look of someone who'd been born in Montana but educated elsewhere. His attorney was an imposing woman in her 60s whose reputation preceded her. She'd never lost a land use case in the western part of the state. My attorney, Jessica Morris, had prepared meticulously. After introductions, she laid out our position. My client controls access to a significant portion of Bridger Ridge Estates through a narrowly defined easement. He is willing to grant the necessary permits for your construction project, but he requires certain concessions in return. Wallace's attorney leaned forward. "What sort of concessions?" I prepared a list, which Jessica distributed. First, the immediate resignation of Vivian Hargrove and Howard Spaulding from the HOA board. I began. Wallace gave a short laugh. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious," I assured him. Second, the appointment of an independent auditor to review all HOA finances for the past 5 years, with any misappropriated funds to be returned. "That's not within my power," Wallace protested. "You control 3 board seats and have significant influence over the other members," Jessica pointed out. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Third, I continued, a comprehensive revision of the architectural review process, with clear, objective standards that are applied consistently to all homeowners. Fourth, reimbursement of all fines and remediation costs assessed against my property and others who have been targeted for selective enforcement. And finally, a binding agreement that the easement across my property will be formally transferred to a neutral third party, a land trust that will ensure fair access for all homeowners in perpetuity. Wallace studied me for a long moment. "You thought this through." "I've had plenty of motivation," I replied. His attorney whispered something in his ear, and he nodded. "We'll need to discuss this privately." "Of course," Jessica said, "but I should mention that my client has also filed for permits to begin construction on his 40 acres next month." Wallace's head snapped up. "Construction? What kind of construction?" I smiled. "Nothing elaborate. Just a nice, tall privacy fence along both sides of the easement corridor. Perfectly compliant with county regulations, of course. The message was clear. If Wallace didn't agree to my terms, access to Bridger Ridge would soon resemble a narrow canyon between two fences, functional but hardly the prestigious entrance that luxury home buyers expected. "Give us the room, please," Wallace said to his attorney, who looked surprised but complied. Jessica also stepped out, leaving just the two of us. Once we were alone, Wallace's demeanor changed. "You know, Lind, I almost admire your play here. It's the kind of move I might have made in your position." "I'll take that as a compliment." He leaned back in his chair. "Vivian has been useful to me. She maintains property values, keeps the riffraff out, makes sure everything looks just so. Buyers want that level of protection. What they want is reasonable assurance that their investment is secure," I countered. "Not a petty tyrant who fines them for having the wrong shade of red on their barn door." Wallace actually chuckled at that. "She does get carried away sometimes. She's out of control, and you know it. The question is whether protecting her is worth jeopardizing your final phase of development." He studied me for a long moment. "I can make Vivian and Howard resign. The audit and the architectural review changes are doable. The reimbursements will need to come from the HOA reserves, not my pocket. And the easement transfer to a land trust." He sighed. "That's the sticking point. That easement has strategic value to me beyond this development." I'd suspected as much. The road didn't just serve Bridger Ridge. It could potentially provide access to hundreds of acres of undeveloped land beyond our community. Land that Wallace likely had plans for. "Here's my final offer," I said. "The easement stays with me for now, but I'll grant your construction permits and enter into a separate agreement giving you an option to purchase a wider easement for future development, at fair market value, as determined by independent appraisal." Wallace considered this, then slowly nodded. "I can work with that." We called our attorneys back in and spent the next 2 hours hammering out the details. By the end of the day, we had a framework agreement that would fundamentally reshape Bridger Ridge Estates and end Vivian's reign of terror. As I drove home that evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The fight wasn't over. Implementing these changes would meet resistance, and Vivian wouldn't go quietly. But the tide had turned decisively in our favor. Little did I know that Vivian had one last desperate move to make before admitting defeat. The board meeting following my agreement with Wallace was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. I arrived early to find the parking lot already full and the community center packed with residents. Word had spread that something significant was in the works, though the details remained confidential. Vivian entered precisely at 7 p.m., her face a mask of composure. She called the meeting to order and moved briskly through the routine agenda items. Only the slight tremor in her hand as she shuffled papers betrayed her tension. Finally, she reached the item labeled simply Developer Update. "Mr. Wallace has requested time to address the membership," she announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Wallace, you have the floor." Cameron Wallace stepped forward, dressed in a crisp blue suit that set him apart from the casual Montana attire of most attendees. He cleared his throat. "Good evening, everyone. I've come tonight to announce some significant changes to the governance of Bridger Ridge Estates." A murmur ran through the crowd. Effective immediately, Vivian Hargrove and Howard Spaulding have submitted their resignations from the board. The murmur became a wave of exclamations. Vivian's face remained impassive, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. Additionally, Wallace continued, "I am appointing an independent accounting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of the association's finances. The 3 developer-controlled board seats will now be held by my representatives, who have been instructed to work collaboratively with the homeowner-elected members to revise the architectural review process and ensure fair and consistent application of the covenants." The room erupted in a mix of reactions: confusion, relief, and in some corners, outrage. Wallace raised his hands for quiet. "I understand these changes may come as a surprise, but they are necessary for the continued success and harmony of this community. The remaining board members will oversee the transition until special elections can be held to fill the vacant seats." As Wallace concluded his remarks, All eyes turned to Vivian, who rose slowly from her chair. "I have served this community faithfully for 5 years," she said, her voice tight. "Everything I have done has been to maintain the standards and values that make Bridger Ridge special. If my efforts are no longer appreciated, so be it. I wish you all luck maintaining what we've built without me." With that, she gathered her things and walked out, Howard trailing behind her. The door closed with a decisive click, and a moment of stunned silence followed before the room exploded in conversation. Frank made his way to my side, grinning widely. "I don't know how you did it, but you actually pulled it off." "We pulled it off," I corrected him. "This was a team effort." The meeting continued under the guidance of the remaining board members. Wallace's representatives, a local attorney, a retired banker, and a university professor, introduced themselves and promised a fresh approach to community governance. A special election was scheduled for the following month to fill the vacated seats. As the meeting broke up, residents gathered in small groups, buzzing with speculation. Many stopped to shake my hand or clap me on the shoulder, having connected the dots between my land purchase and the sudden change in leadership. But the celebration was premature. The next morning, I received a call from Phil Mendoza. "Jack, you need to see this," he said urgently. "I'm sending you an email right now." The email contained a copy of a document filed with the county the previous evening, an amendment to the Bridger Ridge covenants, ostensibly approved by a 2/3 vote of the membership, granting the HOA a 60-foot wide emergency access easement across any adjacent properties for safety and security purposes. "This is bogus," I told Phil after reviewing it. "There was never any membership vote on this." "That's not all," Phil replied grimly. "Drive by the entrance to your 40 acres. 20 minutes later, I stood in stunned disbelief at the edge of my property. A crew was already at work, clearing a wide swath through the trees and brush about 50 yards south of the main road, directly across my land. I approached the foreman, who handed me a copy of a county permit authorizing the construction of an emergency access road, as provided for in the newly filed covenant amendment. "This is a fraudulent document," I told him. "There was never any vote approving this amendment." He shrugged sympathetically. "Above my pay grade, sir. I just go where they tell me and build what's on the plans. You'll need to take it up with the county." I was on the phone with my attorney before I reached my truck. Jessica listened to my explanation, then sighed. "They're playing dirty," she said. "The good news is that fraudulent documents don't create legal rights. The bad news is that by the time we get a judge to issue an injunction, they may have already cut the road through." "Can we get an emergency hearing today?" "I'll try, but it's unlikely. The court calendar is backed up for weeks." I drove directly to the county building and demanded to speak with the planning director. After an hour's wait, I was ushered into his office, only to find Vivian already there, seated comfortably across from the director's desk. "Mr. Lind," the director said, rising to shake my hand. "Mrs. Hargrove was just explaining the emergency access situation at Bridger Ridge." "There is no emergency access situation," I said flatly. "This is a fraudulent document filed without a proper vote of the membership." The director frowned. "Mrs. Hargrove has provided notarized affidavits from the association secretary confirming the vote. Howard Spaulding, the same secretary who just resigned from the board under a cloud of financial impropriety." Vivian's smile didn't waver. "The vote occurred last month, when Howard was still in good standing. The filing was delayed due to administrative oversight." It was a bold lie, but delivered with such confidence that the director looked uncertain. "Mr. Director," I said, struggling to keep my voice level, "I attended every association meeting for the past 6 months. There was never any vote on an emergency access easement. This is a transparent attempt to circumvent my property rights after I purchased land that the HOA thought they controlled." The director looked uncomfortable. "This is becoming a he said, she said situation. If there's a dispute over the validity of association actions, that's a civil matter between you and the HOA. The county has a properly filed document and has issued permits accordingly." "Those permits were issued based on fraudulent information," I insisted. "Then you'll need to seek an injunction from the court," he replied, effectively ending the discussion. As we left the building, Vivian paused beside me on the steps. "Did you really think I would just roll over?" she asked quietly. "This community is my life's work. I won't let you or anyone else destroy it." "This isn't about the community," I replied. "It's about your control, and you've just committed document fraud, which is a felony in Montana." Her confidence faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Prove it. It's your word against mine and Howard's. And we have the documentation." She walked away, her heels clicking on the concrete, leaving me seething with frustration and a growing sense of helplessness. She was right. It would be difficult to prove the vote never happened without extensive testimony from other homeowners, and that would take time we didn't have. Back at my ranch, the clearing work continued. By sunset, they had cut a 30-foot wide path nearly halfway across my property. At this rate, they would reach the other side by the following afternoon. I called an emergency meeting of my supporters that evening. Frank, Phil, the Carrutherses, and a dozen others gathered in my living room as I explained the situation. "She's outmaneuvered us," I concluded. "By the time we get a court to hear our case, the road will be done." "There has to be something we can do," Barbara insisted. "This is blatantly illegal." "Actually," Phil said thoughtfully, "the permit only authorizes clearing and grading. They still need separate permits for any culverts, drainage, or paving." "So we can delay those," I said. "Maybe," Phil conceded, "but they could still push through a rough dirt track that would serve their purpose, creating a second access point that bypasses your gate." Frank had been quiet, but now he spoke up. "What about Wallace? Doesn't your agreement with him prevent this sort of end run?" "It should," I agreed, "but Wallace is out of the country for 2 weeks. I tried to reach him today, but his office said he's unreachable." "Convenient timing," Frank muttered. "Too convenient," I agreed. "I suspect Vivian knew about his trip and timed this specifically to act while he's gone." We spent the next hour brainstorming options, but each seemed more desperate than the last. Legal remedies would take too long. Direct confrontation risked escalating to a level none of us wanted, and while I could physically block the construction, doing so would put me on the wrong side of the law. As the meeting broke up without a clear plan, Phil lingered behind. "Jack, I've been thinking about something," he said once we were alone. "That new road they're cutting, where exactly does it connect to on the other side?" I pulled out the survey map. "It looks like it joins up with the eastern loop of the development road, right about here." I pointed to a spot near the entrance to the final phase of construction. Phil studied the map, his engineer's eyes seeing something I had missed. "And what's this area here?" He pointed to a low-lying section between my property and the development. "That's a seasonal creek bed. It's pretty much dry most of the year, but during spring runoff, it can get substantial flow." Phil's eyes lit up. "Does your deed include water rights to that creek?" "Yes, Mrs. Campbell transferred all water rights with the property." "Why?" "Because," Phil said slowly, "Montana water law is some of the most complex and protective in the country. And if you control water rights to a creek that their emergency road would have to cross." I began to see where he was going. They'd need special permits for that crossing, wouldn't they? "Not just permits," Phil explained. "They'd need a detailed environmental impact study, Corps of Engineers approval for any culvert placement, and your explicit permission as the water rights holder." For the first time since discovering the clearing crew on my land, I felt a glimmer of hope. "How quickly can we file the necessary paperwork to assert those rights?" "First thing tomorrow morning," Phil promised. "And there's one more thing we can do tonight." Under the cover of darkness, Phil, Frank, and I visited the creek bed. Following Phil's instructions, we created a simple diversion using rocks and fallen logs that directed more water into the normally dry streambed. Within an hour, what had been a dusty depression was showing the first signs of flowing water. "By morning, they'll have a genuine waterway to deal with," Phil said with satisfaction. "And changing a waterway without permits is a federal offense." The next morning, I was up before dawn. The water diversion had worked better than we hoped. Overnight, the spring snowmelt had found the path of least resistance down our modified stream bed, creating a respectable flow exactly where the emergency road would need to cross. I was waiting with my camera when the construction crew arrived. The foreman took one look at the flowing stream and let out a low whistle. "This wasn't on the plans," he said. "We can't cross running water without special permits." "It's strange how nature works, isn't it?" I replied innocently. "Must be the early snowmelt from the mountains." By 9 a.m., I had filed formal notices with the County Water Board, the State Department of Natural Resources, and the Corps of Engineers, asserting my water rights and objecting to any unauthorized crossing of the waterway on my property. By noon, the county had issued a stop work order on the emergency road project, pending further environmental review. And by mid-afternoon, I received a call from a very irritated Vivian Hargrove. "What did you do?" she demanded without preamble. "I protected my water rights," I replied calmly. Perhaps if the HOA had consulted with me before attempting to bulldoze a road across my property, we could have discussed appropriate measures for crossing the seasonal creek. That creek has been dry for years. Apparently not this year, I said. Montana's water rights laws are quite clear on this matter. Any construction affecting a waterway requires extensive permitting and environmental review. That process typically takes 6 to 18 months, I'm told. Her frustrated silence told me everything I needed to know. The emergency road gambit had failed. "You know this isn't over," she said finally. "I still have options." "So do I replied before ending the call. The next day, the construction crew removed their equipment from my property. The half-completed clearing remained, an ugly scar across the landscape that would take years to heal naturally. But at least the immediate threat had been neutralized. Word spread quickly throughout Bridger Ridge about Vivian's failed attempt and my water rights counter-move. Opinion continued to shift against her, with even some of her former allies beginning to distance themselves. But as Frank warned me over beers that evening, a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. Vivian's backed into a corner now, and she's got nothing left to lose. He was right, and while I savored this victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that Vivian Hargrove wasn't done fighting yet. The final confrontation was still to come, and it would be the most dramatic yet. 2 weeks passed with an uneasy calm settling over Bridger Ridge. The stop work order on the emergency access road remained in effect, with county officials now requiring a full environmental impact study that would take months to complete. Vivian had gone uncharacteristically quiet, neither responding to inquiries about the fraudulent covenant amendment nor appearing at community functions. The special election to fill the vacated board positions was scheduled for the coming Saturday. Frank had been persuaded to run for one of the seats, along with Barbara Carruthers and a retired judge who had recently moved to the community. The mood among homeowners was cautiously optimistic, with many expressing hope for a more balanced and reasonable HOA going forward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Vivian wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and her silence felt more like the eye of a hurricane than a genuine retreat. My suspicions were confirmed when Frank called me on Friday afternoon, his voice tight with urgency. "Jack, we've got a situation. Special meeting called for tomorrow morning before the election. The subject is enforcement action against Lot 23 and adjacent parcel." My property was Lot 23. The adjacent parcel was clearly my 40 acres. "What kind of enforcement action?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "It doesn't say. But here's the kicker. They've hired Patricia Reeves as special counsel." I let out a low whistle. Patricia Reeves was the most aggressive property litigator in the state, known for representing associations against homeowners and rarely losing. "This is Vivian's endgame," I said. "One last attempt to force me out before she loses control of the board." "What do you think they're planning?" "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but whatever it is, it'll be big. Reeves doesn't come cheap." I spent the evening consulting with Jessica, who was equally concerned about this sudden escalation. "Without knowing exactly what they're planning, it's hard to prepare a defense," she said. "But I'll be there with you tomorrow, and I'm bringing reinforcements." The reinforcements turned out to be Jessica's senior partner, Daniel Wright, a silver-haired legal titan who had argued before the Montana Supreme Court more times than any other active attorney. His specialty, water rights and property law. The meeting room was packed when we arrived the next morning. Temporary chairs had been set up to accommodate what appeared to be every homeowner in Bridger Ridge, along with a few faces I didn't recognize, likely attorneys or other professionals brought in for the occasion. At the board table sat the 4 remaining members, with an empty chair where Vivian would normally preside. Instead, she was seated at a separate table with Howard and a striking woman in her 50s who could only be Patricia Reeves. The meeting was called to order by the vice president, who quickly moved to the single agenda item. The board has called this special meeting to address ongoing and escalating violations by the owner of Lot 23, Jack Lind, and to determine appropriate enforcement actions. As this is a complex legal matter, the association has retained special counsel. I'll now turn the floor over to Ms. Patricia Reeves. Reeves rose smoothly, her movements as precise as her tailored charcoal suit. Thank you. Members of the board, homeowners of Bridger Ridge Estates, I've been asked to provide a legal analysis of certain actions taken by Mr. Lind that constitute violations of your covenants and potentially state law. She activated a PowerPoint presentation on the room's screen, displaying a satellite image of my property and the surrounding area. Mr. Lind has engaged in a pattern of deliberate obstruction and hostile actions against this association. Most recently, he artificially diverted water to create a bogus waterway for the sole purpose of preventing authorized emergency access construction. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Reeves continued, her voice carrying effortlessly through the room. This manipulation of natural water flow constitutes illegal diversion under Montana Code 85-2114, which could subject Mr. Lind to penalties of up to $1,000 per day. Furthermore, his continued obstruction of legitimate HOA business through his control of the easement road represents an unconscionable abuse of power that threatens the safety and well-being of all Bridger Ridge residents. She clicked to the next slide, which listed a series of statutory citations and legal precedents. Based on these violations, I am recommending that the board take immediate and decisive action. Specifically, I propose the board authorize me to file for an emergency injunction compelling Mr. Lind to cease all interference with HOA operations, to immediately remove the gate installed on the access road, and to pay damages of not less than $250,000 for harm caused to the association. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. $250,000? It was an astronomical sum, clearly designed to force me into bankruptcy or submission. Jessica leaned close to whisper in my ear. This is a bluff. They know they can't win this in court, but they're hoping to scare you into a settlement. Daniel Wright nodded in agreement. Classic intimidation tactic. They want the other homeowners to see you as a threat to their property values. Reeves raised her hand for quiet. Additionally, I recommend the board immediately proceed with placing a lion on both Mr. Lind's properties for unpaid fines and assessments, which now total $42,780, and initiate foreclosure proceedings as provided for in your covenants. My heart pounded in my chest. They were trying to take my home and land in one sweeping attack. This is outrageous, Frank called out from across the room. You can't foreclose on someone's property for disputed fines. Actually, they can. Reeves responded coolly. The Montana Supreme Court has consistently upheld associations' rights to foreclose for unpaid assessments, regardless of whether those assessments are disputed. Mr. Lind has been properly notified of all violations and has failed to remedy them or pay the associated fines. As the room descended into chaotic debate, Wright touched my arm. It's time, he said quietly. I nodded, and he rose to his feet. His commanding presence immediately drew attention, quieting the room. If I may, he began, his deep voice resonating with authority. Daniel Wright, representing Mr. Lind. Before this board takes any vote on these proposed actions, you should be aware of several critical facts that Ms. Reeves has conveniently omitted from her presentation. He moved to the front of the room, standing directly opposite Reeves. First, regarding the alleged water diversion, Mr. Lind holds senior water rights to all water flows on his property, rights that predate the establishment of this development by over a century. Those rights include the authority to manage seasonal water flow for beneficial use. Wright pulled a document from his briefcase. I have here a certification from the state water engineer, dated yesterday, confirming that the water flow observed on Mr. Lynn's property is consistent with natural seasonal patterns and authorized water management practices. Reeves started to object, but Wright continued smoothly. Second, regarding the easement road, the original easement agreement, which I have reviewed extensively, grants access for residential ingress and egress only. It does not grant the HOA any authority whatsoever to dictate how the underlying property owner may manage that easement, provided residential access is maintained. He turned to face the homeowners directly. Mr. Lynn has never prevented any resident from accessing their property. He has only regulated commercial traffic, which is absolutely his right as the property owner. Reeves finally managed to interject. Mr. Wright, while this is all very interesting, it doesn't address the fundamental issue of Mr. Lynn's deliberate interference with legitimate HOA operations. Wright smiled slightly. I was coming to that. The covenant amendment purportedly authorizing the emergency access road across Mr. Lynn's property is, to put it bluntly, fraudulent. There was never any membership vote approving such an amendment. That's a serious accusation, Reeves shot back. Do you have proof? Indeed we do. Wright nodded toward the back of the room, where the door had just opened to admit Cameron Wallace, who I hadn't expected back in the country for another week. Mr. Wallace, as the developer and controller of 3 board seats, would certainly have been aware of any legitimate vote on such a significant covenant amendment. Perhaps he can enlighten us. All heads turned to Wallace, who strode confidently to the front of the room. There was no such vote, he stated flatly, and I never authorized my representatives to approve any such amendment. Furthermore, as the original grantor of the easements in question, I can confirm that they were never intended to grant the HOA authority over private property beyond the development boundaries. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Vivian's face had gone pale, while Howard suddenly seemed intensely interested in his hands folded on the table. Reeves recovered quickly. Mr. Wallace, with all due respect, the filed amendment bears the signature of the association secretary and includes an affidavit attesting to a properly noticed membership vote. A forged signature and a false affidavit, Wright countered. Filing fraudulent documents with the county recorder is a Class C felony in Montana. Mr. Spaulding might want to consider that before making any further statements on this matter. Howard's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. He leaned over to whisper urgently to Vivian, who silenced him with a sharp gesture. Wallace addressed the board directly. As the developer and currently the largest stakeholder in Bridger Ridge, I cannot allow this association to engage in potentially criminal activities. I am directing my appointed board members to vote against any enforcement action proposed today, and I strongly urge the elected members to do the same. Frank stood up from his seat in the audience. I'd like to point out that the election polls were supposed to open 15 minutes ago. Perhaps we should proceed with that before taking any action that a new board might not support. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The acting board chair looked uncertainly between Wallace, Reeves, and the assembled homeowners before clearing his throat. I believe that's a reasonable suggestion. This special meeting will recess for 3 hours to allow the scheduled election to proceed. We will reconvene at 1 p.m. to continue this discussion if necessary. As people began moving toward the voting table set up at the back of the room, Vivian conferred intensely with Reeves. Their whispered conversation grew heated, with Reeves finally shaking her head firmly and gathering her papers. I made my way to Wallace, who greeted me with a wry smile. Quite the hornet's nest you've stirred up, Lind. I appreciate you coming back early, I said. Your timing couldn't have been better. I was never actually out of the country, he admitted, just lying low while I had my people investigate this situation thoroughly. Vivian's been useful, but I can't afford to be associated with fraud or harassment. Bad for business. While the voting proceeded, Wright, Jessica, and I huddled in a corner to discuss strategy. The threat of criminal charges for the fraudulent amendment should be enough to bring Spaulding to heel, Wright said. He's the weak link. Jessica nodded. But Vivian is another matter. She's clearly prepared to go down fighting. What about the foreclosure threat? I asked. Could they actually take my home over disputed fines? Technically, yes, Wright admitted, but only after extensive legal proceedings that would take months, if not years. And with Wallace's opposition and a new board likely to be elected today, it's more of a theoretical than practical threat. The voting concluded shortly after noon. As expected, Frank, Barbara, and the retired judge, all reform candidates, won in a landslide. Combined with my seat and Wallace's 3 appointees, this created a solid 7-vote majority against Vivian's faction. When the meeting reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Reeves was gone. Howard sat alone at what had been the Vivian table, looking miserable. Vivian herself arrived just as the meeting was called to order, her face a mask of cold fury. The newly elected board members took their seats, and Frank, who had been chosen as interim chair, addressed the assembly. In light of the election results and the serious questions raised about the legitimacy of the proposed enforcement actions, I move that all pending violations against Lot 23 be suspended pending a comprehensive review by the new board. The motion passed unanimously, with Howard abstaining and Vivian no longer having a vote. I should have felt triumphant, but something about Vivian's demeanor, too composed, almost satisfied, set off warning bells. When she approached the podium during the public comment period, those bells became sirens. "Congratulations on your victory, such as it is," she began, her voice dripping with disdain. "While you've been busy playing politics, I've been protecting this community's interests. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I filed a petition with the county commissioners to create a new special improvement district encompassing all of Bridger Ridge and adjacent properties, including Mr. Lynn's 40 acres. The room erupted in confused questions, but Vivian raised her voice to continue. Under Montana law, this district would assume responsibility for road maintenance, security, and land use regulations, effectively superseding the HOA's authority. The petition has already been signed by owners representing over 60% of the affected property value. Wright was on his feet immediately. That's impossible. Mr. Lynn owns 40 acres, and Mr. Wallace controls all unsold lots. Together, they represent well over 50% of the property in question. Vivian smiled thinly. Actually, as of yesterday, Wallace Development no longer owns the unsold lots. They've been transferred to Bridger Holdings LLC, a company controlled by investors who understand the importance of proper community management. All eyes turned to Wallace, who looked genuinely shocked. "That's absurd. I never sold those properties." "Not you personally," Vivian clarified, "but Bridger Ridge Development Incorporated did. As CEO, your signature isn't required for property transfers approved by the board of directors." Wallace's face darkened. "My board would never approve such a transfer without my knowledge. Your board met yesterday in an emergency session called by the chairman, your cousin Robert. The vote was 3-2 in favor of the sale." This was a bombshell I hadn't anticipated. Even Wallace looked blindsided. Had Vivian somehow outmaneuvered everyone? Wright leaned over to whisper to me, "This is a desperation move." Special improvement districts require extensive public hearings and approval from the county commissioners. It would take months, even years, to implement. But Vivian wasn't finished. Furthermore, as the final act of the previous board, we filed for binding arbitration regarding Mr. Lynn's interference with HOA operations. The arbitration clause in Section 22 of the covenants requires all disputes to be resolved through this process rather than court action. Our filing this morning locked in the arbitrator selection to the 3-member panel specified in the original documents. Wright frowned deeply at this news. I knew why. The original arbitration panel named in the covenants consisted of the development company's attorney, the HOA president, and a 3rd member selected by the other 2. With Vivian still technically president until the board officially transferred power, and with Wallace's company apparently compromised, the arbitration deck would be stacked against me. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with homeowners shouting questions and accusations. Frank struggled to maintain order, finally calling for a recess to consult with legal counsel. In a side room, Wallace paced furiously while making calls to his corporate office. Wright and Jessica huddled over the covenant documents, searching for loopholes in the arbitration clause. "This is a sophisticated play," Wright admitted reluctantly. If they can get a favorable arbitration ruling before the new board can act, it could create binding obligations that would be difficult to unwind. What about the property transfer? I asked Wallace. Can they really sell your lots without your approval? He lowered his phone, his expression grim. It appears my cousin and 2 other board members did have an emergency meeting yesterday. Robert claims it was properly noticed, though I never received any notification. The sale is to a Wyoming LLC with anonymous ownership. The price was fair market value, so there's no obvious breach of fiduciary duty. Vivian's behind it, I said. She must have found investors willing to back her play for control. Almost certainly, Wallace agreed, but proving it will be difficult. And in the meantime, those properties and their votes are no longer under my control. Wright closed the covenant document with a sigh. The arbitration clause is solid. If they've already filed and named the panel, we're at a significant disadvantage. So what do we do? I asked. Wright and Wallace exchanged glances. We need to buy time, Wright said. Delay the arbitration process while we investigate the property transfer. If we can prove improper notice of the board meeting or any irregularities in the sale, we might be able to unwind it. And if we can't, then we fight on multiple fronts, Wallace said, a steely determination in his voice. I don't like being outmaneuvered, especially by someone I trusted. My attorneys will challenge the property transfer in court. Your team can work on delaying or discrediting the arbitration, and the new HOA board can begin the process of amending the covenants to eliminate the arbitration clause entirely. When the meeting reconvened, the mood was somber. Vivian had departed, leaving Howard to distribute copies of the Special Improvement District petition and arbitration filing to the board members. Frank, looking shell-shocked, addressed the assembly. In light of these unexpected developments, the board will need time to consult with legal counsel before taking further action. This meeting is adjourned until next week. As the crowd dispersed, many homeowners approached me with expressions of concern and support. We didn't vote for this special district, Barbara insisted. Vivian must have forged signatures like she did with the amendment, or pressured people into signing without understanding what they were agreeing to, Frank added. Whatever she did, we'll fight it, I promised them. This isn't over. But as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake a feeling of dread. Vivian had shown herself to be far more resourceful and ruthless than I had anticipated. The battle for Bridger Ridge had escalated beyond a simple HOA dispute to something approaching corporate espionage and political manipulation. What I didn't know then was that Vivian's elaborate maneuvers had a fatal flaw, one that would ultimately prove her undoing and lead to the most satisfying resolution I could have imagined. The next week was a blur of legal consultations, document filings, and strategy sessions. Wright and his team worked tirelessly to challenge the arbitration filing, while Wallace's corporate attorneys investigated the suspicious property transfer. The newly elected HOA board, led by Frank, began the process of amending the covenants to remove the problematic arbitration clause, though such changes would require a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, a high bar under the best of circumstances. Meanwhile, Vivian seemed to have vanished. Howard, looking increasingly haunted, refused to answer questions about her whereabouts or the mysterious Bridger Holdings LLC that had purchased Wallace's remaining lots. 10 days after the contentious meeting, I received an unexpected visitor at my ranch. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to my gate, and 2 serious-looking individuals in dark suits approached my front door. "Mr. Lind?" the woman asked, showing me credentials identifying her as Special Agent Teresa Vasquez of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "We'd like to ask you some questions about Vivian Hargrove and certain real estate transactions in Bridger Ridge Estates." I invited them in, bewildered but eager to assist. For the next 2 hours, I recounted the entire saga of my conflict with Vivian and the HOA, from the initial fence dispute to the recent property transfer and Special Improvement District petition. Agent Vasquez took detailed notes while her partner occasionally asked clarifying questions. When I finished, she closed her notebook and fixed me with an intense gaze. "Mr. Lind, what I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation, so I'll need your discretion." When I nodded agreement, she continued, "Vivian Hargrove is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Victoria Harding. She's been on our radar for nearly a decade in connection with a pattern of real estate fraud schemes across multiple states. I stared at her in shocked silence. Her typical approach is to move into high-end developments, gain control of the HOA or similar governance structure, then leverage that position to extract funds or force advantageous property sales. In at least 3 previous communities, she's executed variants of this special improvement district strategy, creating shadow entities that essentially take control of community infrastructure and assets. So the purchase of Wallace's lots is almost certainly part of a larger scheme, Vasquez confirmed. We believe she's working with outside investors who provide capital in exchange for a share of the profits when properties are acquired at below market rates through various pressure tactics. Is that why you're investigating the property transfer? Partly, Vasquez said. But what really caught our attention was the financial activity of the HOA under her leadership. Our analysis suggests approximately $1.2 million has been diverted from association reserves and operating accounts over the past 5 years through inflated contracts, unnecessary consulting fees, and other irregularities. My mind reeled. The financial improprieties I discovered were apparently just the tip of the iceberg. We've been building a case gradually, but your conflict with Harding, accelerated her timeline. She's making moves now that expose her network and methods more clearly than before. What happens next? I asked. That depends partly on you, Vasquez replied. We'd like your cooperation as a witness and potentially as a participant in controlled interactions with Harding and her associates. You want me to wear a wire? I asked incredulously. Nothing so dramatic, she assured me. But we would like you to continue challenging her maneuvers through the proper legal channels, which may prompt her to make further incriminating moves or statements. With your permission, we monitor communications and document any illegal actions. I agreed without hesitation. The idea that Victoria, was not just a petty tyrant, but a sophisticated criminal was both shocking and strangely validating. This had never been just about fence heights or barn colors. It had been about power and profit all along. Under the FBI's guidance, I filed a formal objection to the Special Improvement District petition, challenging the validity of signatures and requesting public verification of each property owner's consent. This seemingly routine legal maneuver had an explosive effect. Within days, several homeowners came forward claiming they had never signed the petition, though their signatures appeared on the document. Others stated they had been told they were signing a simple road maintenance agreement, not a petition for a new governmental entity with broad regulatory powers. The county commissioners, now facing potential involvement in a federal fraud investigation, suspended consideration of the petition pending further review. This dealt a significant blow to Vivian's strategy, which had relied on quick approval before opposition could mobilize. Simultaneously, Wallace's attorneys discovered irregularities in the notice of the emergency board meeting where the property transfer was approved. According to corporate bylaws, such notices had to be delivered in specific ways and with minimum time requirements that had not been met. This provided grounds for a temporary injunction freezing the transferred properties, while the court considered the validity of the sale. With both the Special Improvement District and the property transfer stalled, Vivian's carefully constructed scheme began to unravel. Howard Spaulding, facing potential charges for his role in filing fraudulent documents, approached the FBI through his attorney seeking a cooperation agreement. His testimony provided crucial details about how the operation worked and who was involved. 3 weeks after the FBI's initial visit to my ranch, a coordinated series of raids targeted addresses in 4 states. Vivian/Victoria was arrested at a luxury resort in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, along with 5 accomplices, including the mysterious investors behind Bridger Holdings LC. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. According to the indictment, the group had targeted at least 7 high-end developments across the Mountain West over the past decade, siphoning millions from HOA accounts and manipulating property values to force distressed sales they could profit from. The news hit Bridger Ridge like a bombshell. Homeowners who had supported Vivian were horrified to learn they had been pawns in a criminal enterprise. Those who had opposed her felt vindicated but also violated. No one had suspected the depth of her deception. For me, the resolution brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the threat to my property was eliminated. Satisfaction that justice was being served. But also a lingering sense of unease about how vulnerable our community had been to such manipulation. The new HOA board, under Frank's steady leadership, worked diligently to rebuild trust and establish more transparent, balanced governance. The covenants were amended to require supermajority approval for any enforcement actions involving fines over $1,000, and the architectural review process was completely overhauled to include clear, objective standards. A forensic audit revealed that nearly $350,000 had been misappropriated from Bridger Ridge's accounts during Vivian's tenure. Most of it was recovered through asset seizures associated with the criminal case, but the experience left everyone more vigilant about financial oversight. As for my 40 acres and the contentious road access, I worked with Wallace to create a fair, sustainable solution. We established an independent land trust to manage the easement, with a board comprised of both development representatives and homeowners. The trust ensured reasonable access while protecting both my property rights and the community's needs. My fence? I eventually replaced it with a design that satisfied both aesthetic considerations and practical requirements, not because the HOA demanded it, but because it was the right choice for the property. The half-cut emergency access road was restored and replanted with native grasses and wildflowers, gradually erasing the scar left by Vivian's desperate gambit. 6 months after Vivian's arrest, we held a community barbecue at my ranch. Nearly every homeowner attended, including some who had once been firmly in Vivian's camp. As the sun set behind the Bitterroots, casting that golden light that had first made me fall in love with this place, Frank raised a toast. To good neighbors and fair rules, he said, lifting his beer, and to Jack, who taught us all that sometimes fighting back isn't just about winning. It's about protecting what matters. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the bonfire burned low, Barbara Carruthers approached me. "You know what the irony is," she said, gazing out over the peaceful landscape. "Vivian always claimed she was protecting property values, but now that she's gone and we have reasonable people in charge, houses in Bridger Ridge are selling for record prices." It was true. The community's reputation had actually been enhanced by the story of how homeowners had banded together to overcome corruption and establish more equitable governance. What had once been marketed as an exclusive enclave was now known for something more valuable: a genuine sense of community built on mutual respect rather than rigid control. As for me, the peace I'd sought in Montana had finally arrived. My ranch was no longer just a piece of property to be defended. It was truly home. The fence that had started it all now seemed like such a small thing, though the principles it represented remained as important as ever. Sometimes I drive out to my gate, the one I installed at the boundary of my 40 acres, and reflect on the journey that brought us here. The gate stands open most days, a reminder that good boundaries and mutual respect make for the best neighbors. The HOA put up a fence on my ranch, but what they created was an opportunity, not just for revenge, but for something far more valuable: the chance to build a community where rules serve people, not the other way around. And that, in the end, was the sweetest victory of all: the end.